In a world where security should be paramount over everything else, the digital society in which we currently live has seen breaches of security that have threatened our personal and financial information. You can prevent all that with the Defense Enabling Assistance Framework, or DEAF protection. Keep your records private, your telephone conversations private, and any data that you may send through your cell phone. DEAF protection is the answer. Visit our website at defprotection.com. That's defprotection.com. In real history, the story of the Mafia can become somewhat convoluted. But historians and researchers alike have documented the existence of a secret organization with remarkable clarity. Motion pictures, television, and theater portrayals may lean toward the melodramatic, but the average person can still grasp that a secret organization existed, and in some forms still exists today. Although only Sicilians were allowed entry into the Mafia, laymen attempt to group Italians within this organization as well. Here on True Crime, Man's Dark Imagination, we're going to present a profile on what has been described as the first American Don. Many people throughout the world find a morbid fascination with the history and inner workings of the violent conglomeration known as the Mafia. Perhaps this interest stems from the manner in which the organization dealt or deals with treachery, establishing territory within which to conduct their business, or the mystique that accompanies a life of power and wealth through illegal means. Our story begins in one of the largest cities in the Deep South.
On the morning of April 1st, 1869, a man waited in the doorway of a business located on Toulouse Street in the Fresh Quarter of New Orleans. He stood there as a wagon with pots and pans clanged along the cobblestone street, meandering past him. The waiting man stood nervously as he wondered whether the man he needed to see would have his usual bodyguard near his side. As he swayed back and forth in a fidgety motion, the man he needed to see turned the corner with his bodyguard walking right next to him. See, a feud had been brewing between rival factions of a criminal organization that originated in the Old Country, between members from Palermo and Messina in Sicily. The man with the bodyguard had recently retreated into a hideout, but now believed himself and his family safe, as he proclaimed himself the victor in the struggle. So he ventured out and wanted to meet with one of the local bosses to discuss a possible alliance. Raphael Anello believed himself invincible, but on that spring New Orleans morning, a blunderbuss pistol pierced Anello's perceived invincibility. Anello first appeared in Louisiana history as a member of the infamous European Brigade that fought during the American Civil War. Historical records do not make clear as to when he arrived in Louisiana. In April of 1862, the mayor of New Orleans, John T. Monroe, ordered that the European Brigade would be policing the city during the dreaded Union occupation. Now, some historians believe that Anello actually controlled Little Palermo in the New Orleans area, using his position within the brigade to exert control over the Sicilians in the city, and even more importantly, over the criminal enterprises that he hoped to cultivate with his newfound power. Many of the Sicilians within the city had come from the western half of Sicily and gave him the title of Zou, which meant uncle. Other Sicilians felt a distrust for Anello, namely those immigrants who settled in the area from Messina, Sicily. But those immigrants bowed down to the boss from Palermo just to keep from going to war in the New World. Raphael Anello, along with his brother Joseph, projected themselves as godfathers of New Orleans, even at this early point in the organization's existence within the city. Often the two were seen strutting through the French Quarter, where Raphael accepted the praises from those that met him and treated the citizens as if they were his children. Anello gained the reputation of keeping the Sicilians in line and maintaining order and discipline along the docks of the city. Also at this time, another Sicilian arose as a successful businessman and received respect from the Sicilian population because of his business acumen, rather than garnering fear from them. At this time, during the early history of the Mafia in New Orleans, Anello and man of respect, Joseph P. Macheca, got along famously. Then, suddenly, the two warring factions fought for control of the New Orleans docks. New Orleans, Louisiana became the first city within the United States to have a Mafia presence, and Joseph Macheca filled the shoes of that title more than Anello. Macheca was born Peter J. Savannah Jr. on the island of Sicily in 1843. 2 years after Macheca's birth, his father, Peter Sr., went to prison. Because his mother couldn't care for the young boy, she left her son at the doors of a local orphanage. When Peter Jr.'s mother later remarried, she reclaimed her son from that orphanage. Her present husband adopted the boy and gave him his name Joseph P. Macheca. After the family made their way to Louisiana, the only life that young Joseph ever knew was that of the mafiosi. He rose steadily in the underworld, and while in his teens he established several successful, illegitimate businesses. Joseph Macheca also made a reputation as a mover and shaker in the business world of the Bayou State. Many historians have maintained that Macheca, even at this young age, he was only in his teens, set up the hierarchy and business structure of the modern mafia we see today. Therefore, it's not an unfair assessment to profess that Macheca became the father of the American Mafia, and not Anello. Prior to the rise within the local mafia, media outlets at the time made very few references to the criminal organization. Newspapers described the mafia as engaging in vendettas, or acts of revenge to settle offenses against either a person or a family. The most successful Italian Sicilian immigrants suffered from rumor and innuendo. Even at this young age, Macheca established himself as a chief mafioso. But at the age of 17, when Louisiana seceded from the Union and entered the war on the Confederate side, he served the 22nd Louisiana Regiment, but only for 9 months. According to incomplete and indecipherable sources, although there seemed to be some historical justification for his movement at the time, Macheca only enlisted in the Confederate Army for 90 days. Because the Confederacy perceived a Union invasion of the South, the Confederate government extended the 90-day enlistments to 9 months. After his enlistment ended, Macheca moved his family business to Houston, Texas, and entered into smuggling for the Confederacy. When the war finally ended in 1865, Macheca sought to expand any criminal influence through his involvement in Louisiana politics upon his return to New Orleans after the war. With the wealth he garnered from his wartime smuggling, Macheca purchased real estate, increasing his wealth exponentially. One of the companies he organized, a steamship company that imported fruit from Central and South America, seemed more profitable than the other businesses. Realizing that his business created enough illegal and legal wealth to support his family and crime organization, Macheca ventured into the seedy world of Louisiana politics. After the American Civil War, the South, especially Louisiana, sought to return their social structure back to the antebellum period where racial mores dictated white supremacy. After the passage of a law that divided the former Confederacy into 5 military districts, Macheca learned that the Reconstruction government in Louisiana was controlled by Republicans and that the white Democrats of the state tried to fight the dictates of the U.S. Congress by intimidating newly emancipated voters within the state. In 1868, an organization named the Knights of the White Camellia formed to combat the Republicans and adopt the same basic tenets of the Ku Klux Klan. Choose the correct political party or receive beatings, or worse. Macheca saw his opportunity to gain political power through the machinations that were occurring at the time. For the first time since he arrived in Louisiana, Macheca's actions were greatly publicized. In 1868, Macheca organized and funded an organization named the Inocente, a politically motivated force that mainly consisted of Sicilians, although other groups were represented within the organization. With the forming of this group, Anello believed that they would be a rival to his control. The Inocente began posting guards around the area known as Little Palermo, cutting into Anello's protection rackets, along with the Louisiana Lottery's business cutting into the boss's numbers rackets. One of Anello's lesser rivals, Latero Barber, was cut down by a shotgun blast at the corner of Chartis and St. Philip Streets on October 26, 1868, which many in the Sicilian community strongly believed that Anello had sanctioned. An innocent person had been implicated, but that person had an alibi, and Anello's involvement with the Barber murder became more solidified. Unlike Anello, Macheca sought to increase his power base and trust from the white nativists by openly supporting local political candidates as well as those in presidential races. The problem with this facet is that it brought unwanted publicity towards the underworld of the city, an enlightenment that most underworld figures avoided intensely. Although Macheca worked to gain influence in the political spheres of the city, early in 1868 the battle lines became more pronounced between the various Sicilian factions who took sides as a result of the Barber murder. Palermo faction on one side and the Messina faction on the other. Joseph Anello, Raphael's brother, also known as Peppino within the Sicilian community, wanted to deflect any implications that his brother was responsible for Barber's murder. Peppino threw a party at his house on Royal Street in December of 1868 and invited the warring factions. And for a few hours it seemed that the partygoers enjoyed themselves, with copious amounts of food and drink. Although the various groups at odds with each other attended the gathering, Macheca and his Stupighieri faction refused to attend the celebration. When the party began to dissipate, Barber's successor to the Messinian faction, Joseph Bonanno, cornered a close ally to Anello, Alphonse Matteo, leveled accusations that Matteo was the trigger man who killed Barber. Matteo brandished a knife. Bonanno pulled a weapon from his topcoat and fired immediately into Matteo's face, blowing off his nose with a round exiting the back of his neck. The Messinians fled the party quickly, and Raphael Anello pursued them through the streets of the French Quarter. Anello fired a shot, hitting Bonanno in the back as he fled. Friends of the Messinian boss carried him through the area and found him medical help. After this incident, Macheca saw the Messinians as an ally and backed their efforts. Many members of the Inocente joined the Anello faction, further defining the battle lines between what would later occur between the conflicting families. Knowing his life was in danger as he was recognized as the group's leader, Raphael Anello went into hiding, trusting his brother to run his businesses. Under the auspices of his brother Joseph, Anello eliminated his rivals in the much populated French Quarter and Poydras markets, as well as throughout the state of Louisiana. On February 15, 1869, Joseph Anello and several other members of the Anello mob rushed a house on Charter Street looking for Bonanno. After a pitched gun battle, Bonanno took another round to his leg. After this incident, Bonanno and members of his mob fled to Galveston, Texas, where they remained for a time, but returned within a month. Again, the Anellos attacked Bonanno and his gang in another gunfight at the Poydras Market. Only one person was killed, and he was an Italian grocer named David Clark, who sustained a wound to the throat, dying 10 days later. 2 of Bonanno's men were arrested and thrown in the Orleans Parish Prison. Even with Raphael Anello in hiding, the violence seemed to reach a fever pitch in New Orleans in the spring of 1869. At the time, it appeared that Raphael Anello negotiated a truce with Macheca and managed to come out of hiding. On April 1st, 1869, a now liberated Anello resumed walking around Little Palermo. On that Thursday morning, believing he had won a victory and emerged as the sole boss of New Orleans, Frank Cicero, godson and bodyguard to Raphael Anello, stepped onto Royal Street, looked around, and signaled to his godfather that the coast was clear. Anello walked the streets of the French Quarter in a self-aggrandized triumph, strolling past the inhabitants of the area. They kissed Anello's hands, praising him as godfather, paying him his due respect. As the Anello entourage made their way past Jackson Square towards Toulouse Street, they turned right, and just after turning, they made their way past Macheca's shop. Just then, a loud noise could be heard coming from Old Levee Street, distracting both Anello and Cicero. When Cicero turned around to his godfather, he saw a man in a long frocked coat pointing a blunderbuss pistol at Anello. Cicero attempted to draw his pistol, but it was too late. A loud shot rang out, and his godfather lay on the street, bleeding into the gutter with large bullet wounds deep into his skull. What Cicero didn't realize was his godfather was dead before he hit the ground. Cicero gave chase through the French Quarter, firing shots as he ran, and Cicero wounded the man, but the assassin escaped through a local bakery. Later, after the police brought Cicero to headquarters, he could not identify an arrested suspect. Macheca soon became the undisputed head of the Sicilian crime families in the New Orleans area. Or at least he controlled the finances as his businesses continued to flourish, and his power consolidated more and more behind the economic and political atmospheres. It was this prominence that later caused Macheca's downfall and interrupted the Mafia's grip on society. Since the end of the Civil War, Louisiana became overrun with what became called scalawags, or Northern Republicans who had come to the South seeking money-making opportunities. The political and racial climates also escalated. Because of the rush of invaders during this period, not to mention that political parties and their military arms were lining up against each other, the heated atmosphere of political rivalries and racial animus reached a fevered pitch in the fall of 1872. Earlier that year, an organization known as the White League traveled to different areas of the state and systematically massacred Republicans and blacks. In the summer of 1874, Macheca and the Italian Association sided with the White League and the Democratic Party at the time. At the beginning of September, the White League prepared for a major confrontation with the Republican forces in the city of New Orleans known as the Metropolitan Police Force, staffed mostly by freed blacks and commanded by former General Algernon Badger. The Democrats sought a coup d'etat, and the Metropolitans and the Republican allies stood in their way. The White League had transported some Belgian rifles to the port city, but the police captured them. It was then that the White League descended in force on the city of New Orleans. What resulted from this mass entrance into the city went down in Louisiana history as the Battle of Liberty Place, which occurred September 14, 1874. On that afternoon, opposing forces of the Metropolitans and the White League clashed at where is now located Harrah's Casino. Macheca wondered whether he and the Italians should get involved. Loyal factions of the Innocente and his regime presented Macheca with an opportunity to further align he and his organization to gain further influence with the infrastructure of Louisiana power. Macheca placed members of his force in the present-day French Quarter and proceeded to help the White League defeat the Metropolitan Police Force, a mostly black organization fighting for the Republicans in the South. Because of his contributions to the White League's victory, Macheca believed that he would receive a great deal of recognition, but the media of the day failed to mention his contribution. Although the criminal underworld may have disagreed with his actions on the day following the battle, Macheca believed he should have received some recognition for his efforts within the media and voiced his disappointment that he wasn't mentioned to his satisfaction in the local newspapers. Although no publicity towards his heroic actions were not that well known, Macheca was accepted by the elite powers in the city as the godfather of New Orleans Mafia, but soon the elite saw Macheca as an economic liability. As time passed, the criminal underworld of New Orleans seemed to coexist with law enforcement. Most historians deem Macheca to merely be a criminal rather than a criminal underlord. But history records that Macheca gained control of the New Orleans docks, if not as a legitimate businessman, then as the boss behind the scenes. But historians tend to cite the arrival of another mafia figure as being the true first godfather of New Orleans at that time. In truth, Macheca gave a fugitive bandito a home in the New World, rather than allowing a mafia ne'er-do-well to crown himself the prince of the New Orleans underworld. Giuseppe Esposito, an infamous bandito from Sicily, made his way to New Orleans in 1879 to escape from a failed kidnapping and mutilation of English tourist George Rose. Although Rose survived the attempt, he returned to England missing both of his ears. Italian authorities were hot on the bandit's trail, and he found New Orleans to be very welcoming. Once he arrived in New Orleans in late 1879, Esposito blended with the Italian population, and Macheca allegedly took the man into his local organization. However, Esposito had been recognized in the French Quarter, and police officers arrested the fugitive. At first, Esposito denied that he was the man the police were looking for at the time, but two detectives from New York had warrants for the bandito. Two New Orleans detectives, David C. Hennessy and his cousin Mike Hennessy, assisted with the apprehension of Esposito. Eventually, officials from Sicily returned Esposito back to the island for trial, and he spent the rest of his life in prison. After Esposito's departure, Macheca's organization split into two factions, one led by Charles Matranga, with Macheca as consigliere, or advisor, and the other family led by Joseph Provenzano. The fracture of the Mafia family signified that the two would engage in mortal combat for control of the city and the power that came with underworld supremacy. With these gang wars commencing, prejudice and stereotyping against Italians became more virulent. As the violence increased, the more the animosity towards them became visible. Macheca continued to play a role in the rise of the Mafia in the South, and the business leaders of the New Orleans area recognized that the Italians could perhaps gain financial control over the city and the rest of the South if something wasn't done to quell their expansion. Even as the mysterious tales of the Mafia inner workings surfaced in the media and through word of mouth, Macheca tried to maintain some air of legitimacy as a businessman. Because of the lucrative fruit trade that passed through the New Orleans docks, the Provenzano-Matranga War seemed to heat up with reckless abandon. Charles Matranga and Macheca convinced workers who were already employed with the Provenzano family to switch sides and work for them. This created a deep-seated hatred between the Matranga and Provenzano families, which came to a critical mass on a muggy spring night. After a long day of emptying the hold of a large steamer named the Foxhall, dock workers Girolamo Jim Caruso, Vincent Caruso, Jim's brother and Matrango and Lacasio foreman, Salvatore Sunseri, Antonio Tony Matranga, Sebastiano Incardona, and Tony and Frank Lacasio all piled into a wagon and made the journey home on the evening of May 5th, 1890. Lumbering toward the French Quarter, Jim Caruso exited the wagon, bidding the other riders goodnight, and entered his home. As the wagon reached the corner of Ursuline and Durgeois streets, one of the men began to sing in Italian, and despite the exhausted conditions that the men endured that day, the rest of them joined in on the song. When the wagon reached the intersection of Claiborne and Esplanade, this meant they were extremely close to the end of their journey and the slumber they so richly deserved. Incardona noticed in his tired condition that there were 6 Italian men standing at the corner that he surmised were waiting for a streetcar. Just then, the man yelled something in Italian, and then all of them, in concert, raised their shotguns and opened fire on the wagon. Tony Matranga took shotgun pellets to the right thigh, but Incardona remained unharmed as he dove under the wagon's front seat to avoid the barrage. The incident took only a few seconds to unfold. Matranga was the lone casualty. Later that same day, Jim and Vincent Caruso, Sunseri, Matranga, Incardona, and the Lucasios identified Joseph and Peter Provenzano, Tony Pellegrini, Nick Guillo, Tony Gianfocaro, and Gaspardo Lombardo as the men who fired the shotguns at the wagon. The Matranga-Provenzano War had finally bubbled to the surface, leading many New Orleanians to suspect that a blood vendetta had been executed on that muggy May evening. Authorities arrested those in the Provenzano faction that were suspected of their involvement in the shotgun incident and demonstrated to the denizens of the city that the administration finally decided to get serious about the Italian criminal problem. In 1888, Mayor Joseph A. Shakespeare swept into office with a promise to reform the police department, as well as tackle the perceived immigrant problem within the city. Shakespeare had already served as mayor of New Orleans in a previous term, but made relatively no reform. As a symbol of his reform commitment within the most recent administration, Mayor Shakespeare brought on David C. Hennessy, a man of questionable reputation, as police commissioner of New Orleans. Hennessy made his reputation earlier in his career with the capture and extradition of Giuseppe Esposito some years before, as he and his cousin helped to capture the wily bandit. As a footnote to this story, David Hennessy had been acquitted when he murdered a man in cold blood, Thomas Devereaux. Some believe that Hennessy may have been courting favor with either the Matranga or the Provenzano families, or both. At the conclusion of the new trial, Judge Baker ruled that there were certain constitutional irregularities and granted a new trial for the defendants. Judge Joshua Baker set the new trial for the accused Provenzano assailants for October 22, 1890. The Matrangas became incensed that the jurist granted the trial and firmly believed that Chief Hennessy has something to do with the legal maneuver. It was then that those involved with the case believed that Hennessy sided with the Provenzanos and wanted the Matranga family destroyed. In any case, the defense cited Chief David Hennessy as one of the witnesses to testify. As the star witness against the Matrangas, Chief Hennessy made a reputation for himself as a tough cop, but operated under some sort of shady mantle. Hennessy grew up in an atmosphere of violence as his father, Dave Hennessy, drew the hatred of Southerners as he stayed in New Orleans after the Civil War as part of the Union occupation. It also appeared that Hennessy and Macheca had crossed paths several times, and no love existed between the two from the moment they met. Because of Macheca's affiliation with the Matranga family as consigliere, what happened next brought the Mafia, whether real or imagined, within the close scrutiny of the citizens and law enforcement within New Orleans. On the evening of October 15, 1890, Chief Hennessy, after eating a meal of oysters and milk, left a local restaurant in the company of a fellow law enforcement officer named William Billy O'Connor. They headed towards the residence that he shared with his elderly mother on Girard Street, near where the present-day Superdome sits. Captain O'Connor and Chief Hennessy parted company at the corner of Girard, when Hennessy walked down the street and eventually made his way onto the front porch. Hennessy unlocked the door to the house, and then with his back towards the street, he heard someone whistle. As he turned to investigate, shotgun blasts broke the silence of the night and tore through his topcoat, lodging in his chest, arm, and right leg. In an attempt to return fire, Hennessy reached for his service weapon and fired several shots. But with his debilitating wounds, his shots missed their intended marks. Concerned that his elderly mother may see him wounded, Hennessy staggered to the front porch of Mrs. Henry Gillis, located at 189 Basin Street, where Hennessy collapsed on the porch. Officer J.C. Rowe arrived on the scene and attempted to open fire on the assailants, but several shots had been fired in Rowe's direction, striking him in the right ear. This forced the young policeman to retreat away from the scene. An ambulance hurriedly transported the mortally wounded chief to Charity Hospital. Later that evening, Captain O'Connor gave a statement regarding the incident. The shaken lawman stated that he left Hennessy at the corner of Girard Street. O'Connor turned and walked just a few seconds down the street when he heard a report of shotguns near Hennessy's home. The night proved muggy and thick, and when O'Connor ran to Hennessy's residence, the air was filled with gun smoke and smelled heavily of gunpowder. But Hennessy was not there. As Hennessy went to the Gillis residence, Captain O'Connor followed the blood trail and found Hennessy laying on the Gillis' porch. Hennessy then motioned for O'Connor to kneel down so he could tell him who shot him. O'Connor knelt down and Hennessy whispered, "Oh, Billy, Billy, they've given it to me and I've given it back as best I could." When O'Connor asked, "Who gave it to you, Dave?" Hennessy responded, "The Dagos." Later at the hospital, when someone asked Hennessy who shot him, the wounded chief shook his head from side to side in a negative way and kept his mouth shut. At the hospital, the doctors deemed Hennessy's wounds to be fatal and stated they could not control the bleeding. Finally, at 8 p.m. the next evening, October 16, 1890, Reverend Father O'Neill gave the last rites. With his mother sitting at the side of his bed, he whispered to her, "Mother, what do you want down here? I'll be home by and by." After his assurance, Hennessy fell asleep, and later in the evening, his breathing became more labored. At 9:20 p.m., the chief expired. The subsequent autopsy report stated that Hennessy succumbed to internal hemorrhaging as a result of the gunshot wounds. The following day, Police Chief David C. Hennessy's body lay in state at his Girard Street residence until 10 a.m. the next day. Then a hearse transported his remains to Gallia Hall on St. Charles Avenue to again lie in state. One observer noted,
All day long the people crowded in to view the body, and it was almost impossible to reach the bier, which had been placed in the same room in which the body of Jefferson Davis lay in state. The cortege moved through the principal streets of the city, all of which were so crowded with people as to blockade the streetcars and the passage of vehicles.
A police escort then brought the body of the dead chief to St. Patrick's Church, and then to the infamous Metairie Cemetery where he lays today. His inscription was somewhat embellished as the population of the city knew Hennessy's reputation. The inscription read, "David C. Hennessy. His life was honorable and brave. His fidelity to duty was sealed with his death." Even though a great deal of mention has been made regarding Hennessy's unsavory and sometimes corrupt reputation, the local media made him the quintessential hero. Since no other evidence existed regarding the assailants in the matter, law enforcement officials and the Shakespeare administration took it upon themselves to accuse and nearly convict those that may have been responsible for the death of their beloved chief. Mayor Shakespeare made a statement before the New Orleans City Council following the assassination of David Hennessy, where he exhibited grief at the loss of his friend.
I express indignation that he should have died at the hands of assassins. The circumstances of the cowardly deed. We owe it to ourselves and to everything we hold sacred in this life to see to it that this blow is the last. We must teach these people a lesson that they will not forget for all time.
Thereafter, the authorities arrested over 200 Italians who may have been members of the secret criminal organization and retained 19 of them to stand trial for the murder of Chief Hennessy. Petro Natali, Antonio Scafidi, Antonio Bagnetto, Manuel Polizzi, Antonio Marchesi, Pietro Monteserio, Sebastiano Incardona, Salvatore Sanseri, Loretto Comites, Carla Traina, and Charles Poliz. Police also arrested Charles Matranga and Joseph Macheca, although the two had unshakable alibis for the time of Hennessy's assassination. The trial of Macheca and company took place in mid-February and lasted for 6 weeks until March 13, 1891. The finest legal minds in the South took part on both the prosecution and the defense sides. Even though there were several events within the trial itself that made for a legal circus, including the total meltdown of defendant Polizzi, Judge Joshua Baker, the jurist, made a motion sua sponte, meaning made by the court itself, that the case against Charles Matranga and another defendant be dropped for lack of evidence. The jury deliberated for quite some time and finally reached their verdict, pronouncing the defendants not guilty. Observers who watched the whole trial believed that the verdict could have gone either way, with both sides presenting arguments that could have swayed the jury to acquittal or conviction. But in the end, the jury voted to acquit. However, this did not calm the nativists of the city who believed the Italians guilty of wholesale murder of the top law enforcement officer of the city, and some at the time strongly believed the jury had been bribed to find the Italians not guilty. Immediately after the trial, the acquitted men were escorted back to the old parish prison, located on Tremay Street in North Claiborne, for their protection. On the following morning, March 14, 1891, an announcement appeared in the newspaper that called for all good citizens to meet at the Henry Clay statue at the foot of Canal Street near the Mississippi River to remedy the failure of justice in the Hennessy case. After an hour of speeches made by members of the legal community and those of the elite citizenry, the crowd raised itself into a frenzy and began to march to the old parish prison. The crowd had been estimated to have grown to over 10,000 before the march commenced. Most felt that the jury failed to render any justice for the murder of Chief Hennessy, and the group leaders called for the crowd to right the wrongs of justice. The Italian consul in New Orleans, Pascal Corte, feared the worst when he read the advertisement in the morning paper. He hurriedly rushed to see Mayor Shakespeare, but the wily mayor disappeared unexpectedly. Louisiana Attorney General Walter Henry Rogers and Orleans Parish Criminal Sheriff Gabrielle Villery arrived at the mayor's office. The three then rode together to a house on the outskirts of the city to visit with Governor Francis T. Nichols to see if he would intervene. Seated at a table eating breakfast, Governor Nichols stated that he did not perceive any violence would occur and saw no need to interfere. The governor suggested that Corte eat some breakfast with him, as the chief executive sent a message to the Pickwick Club, an elitist meeting site where Mayor Shakespeare often frequented. Governor Nichols waited for a reply, and Counsel Corte sat nervously. He did not eat. By the time Corte made it to Governor Nichols' lodgings, the large throng made their way through the city streets, past the markets and Congo Square, where any Italian found in the open was beaten mercilessly. Hearing the crowd approaching the prison walls, Captain Lemuel Davis, the captain in charge of the prison guards, readied his men. In a panic that the gates would soon breach, Captain Davis moved the 19 Italian prisoners to the female side of the prison. The prisoners decried for weapons with which to defend themselves. Captain Davis denied their appeal. When the gates finally collapsed and the mob rushed in, one of the men who entered ahead of the rest turned to the crowd and asked if any of the men could recognize the suspected assassins. "We don't want to shed innocent blood," the man shouted, an odd statement to make inside the gates of a prison in front of a bloodthirsty crowd. But once they made their way inside the prison gates, the mob marched up the front stairs of the old prison. An old woman pointed them to another set of stairs, and they made their way to the women's side of the prison. The mob heard footsteps from behind a door, proceeded to burst it down. There they found another staircase leading to the courtyard of the woman's side. Jim Caruso, Montesario, Comites, and Trainer cornered themselves, and when the four men tried to make their way to an open gate, the men carrying Winchester rifles opened fire, cutting the men down where they stood. Elsewhere in the prison, the mob cornered the elder Marchese, Scafidi, and Joseph Macheca was cornered too. When the armed men opened fire, Scafidi sustained a wound above his right eye, blowing out the back of his head. Bullets ripped through Marchese's body, and he fell on top of Scafidi's lifeless form. No one really knew what happened to Macheca until after the smoke had cleared. His body, too, was riddled with hundreds of bullets, with a coup de grace being a small bullet hole behind his right ear. The mob then captured Manuel Polizzi, who many believed was insane, taking him outside of the prison and lynching him on a lamppost on St. Anne Street. Prisoner Bagnetto suffered a most horrific fate when the mob dragged him from the prison, hanged him from a local lamppost, then used his corpse as target practice, with each round causing a loud audible thud as the bullets entered his lifeless body. The other prisoners suffered the same fate, except Charles Matranga. After suffering from a wound in the arm, he managed to pull one of his countrymen's corpses on top of him, and he hid there until the mob left the prison. Counsel Corte rode to the prison and witnessed the carnage's aftermath. He immediately got into his carriage and sped to his office to send a telegram to his superior in Rome, Baron Saverio Fava. When Baron Fava heard the news, he cabled Secretary of State James G. Blaine, expressing deep concern that the U.S. murdered Italian citizens. For a time, Italy threatened war, with the saber-rattling going back and forth between the two countries. The Italians had been spending a lot of their country's budget on the Navy. The U.S. did not possess a powerful Navy, or Army for that matter, and although war had been avoided, the U.S. would have failed dismally in armed conflict with that Mediterranean nation. Subsequently, the U.S. capitulated and then paid out an indemnity of $25,000 to be dispersed evenly to the families of the men who had been executed. Mayor Shakespeare received praise for his actions, or inactions as it were, during and after the lynchings. Several well-wishers even stated that the murders of the Italians at the prison was a justified act. One person wrote a postcard to the mayor and stated,
"We need a Shakespeare here to create a language that the leaders of 30,000 thieves can understand."
The incident involving the murdered Sicilians went down in local and American history as one of the worst lynchings that ever occurred. Although the U.S. paid an indemnity to the surviving families of the murdered men, it appeared that the floodgates opened when it came to seeking out and destroying all who may have been suspected of being members of the Mafia within Louisiana and the United States. Several more lynchings of Italians occurred in the state in 1896 and 1899 respectively. Only hints and rumors, and no evidence existed that those murdered were members of the hated Mafia. Stereotyping ruled over the facts, and distrust generated by white nativists perpetuated these inaccuracies. And the labels generated for Sicilians, Italians, continued throughout the rest of the 19th and 20th centuries. The myth that anyone with a vowel at the end of their name belonged to a secretive criminal organization continued unabated. The shame stood that the bad apples created an atmosphere of fear and loathing from the normal Mediterranean people who underwent the dangers of the perilous journey to become Americans. The innocent suffered with the guilty, and thus law-abiding citizens who contributed to the already thriving culture in the U.S. were marked with the stigma of organized crime.
Of the 19 men that were arrested, only 11 were lynched. The rest walked out of prison after the incident was over, and nothing more was to happen to them. According to historian, retired federal prosecutor, and former FBI agent Sal Perricone, Joseph P. Macheca, for all intents and purposes, can be considered the first American Don, or Godfather. He laid the foundation for future infrastructures of the American Mafia, with legitimate businesses utilized as a cover for the illegitimate ones. His funeral was attended by thousands in the French Quarter, both out of respect and envy. Soon after the death of Joseph P. Macheca, James D. Houston, one of the industrial elites of the New Orleans area, took over Macheca's businesses through the auspices of the Louisiana Construction and Improvement Company. This leads one to believe that not only was the death of the Italians in the Orleans Parish Prison on March 14, 1891, part of a larger plan to rid the city of the Italian business leaders, but also that David C. Hennessy was the sacrifice for that eradication, a sort of collateral damage. The void left through Macheca's death eventually was filled with Charles Matranga, who gave up the title of Godfather in the 1920s and died of natural causes in 1943. Sam, Silver Dollar Sam Carolla, took over from Matranga, and due to many legal problems, he retired as well. After Carolla stepped down, the now infamous Carlos Marcello, the Little Hammer, as he became known, ascended the Mafia throne as the reputed Godfather. Marcello experienced many legal problems, including those with Attorney General Robert Kennedy. Rumors that Marcello had something to do with John F. Kennedy's death refuse to die down even to this day. In an interesting footnote, the city of New Orleans, under the auspices of Mayor LaToya Cantrell, offered an apology to the Italian community of New Orleans for the lynching that occurred on March 14, 1891. And future plans for a monument to the dead 11 Italians have been strongly suggested to the city leaders. If you would like to view the entire interview with Sal Perricone, I will leave a link to this fascinating story within the comments below. If you enjoyed the presentation, please hit like, subscribe, and hit the bell so that you will be alerted as to future upcoming episodes. Also, if you would like to support our channel, we're on Subscribestar, Rumble.com, Facebook, Twitter, and we have a PayPal account. Until next time.
Thank you.